got us going today. So I'm Carrie Finley. I am a member at large on the ASLO Board of Directors, and I'm also on the organizing committee, the scientific committee for this meeting in Madison today. So it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce today's plenary speaker, so Dr. Elena Bennett. So Elena is a professor and a Canada Research Chair in Sustainability Science at McGill University. So Elena has a long list of awards. I'm not even going to attempt to go through them today. She's been awarded more than $10 million in funding over the last several years, and yeah, innumerable awards and recognitions, and this covers a range from teaching to research to outreach, education, and so forth. So she's covered quite a bit of material over the last several years. She is currently a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and in 2022, she was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Science. So over the last couple of days, I've taken the opportunity to reach out to a few people who I know Elena better than I do, just to get a feel for Elena's approach to things and what makes her unique, and why it's good. It's all good. The one thing that really stuck out to me, the comment that jumped out at me, is her positivity. The positivity and the optimism that she has. I think, John, you articulated this really well just now about how easy it is to get bogged down by what's going on in the world, our environmental situation, how we're dealing with this politically and socially, and it can get really heavy for all of us, I think. And so it can be really challenging to find that positivity, to find the optimism, and use that to find opportunities to fix it, to find solutions. And so Elena has been working towards this really nicely, I believe, over the last many years. So she does this through striving to work collaboratively to find these solutions. She does this through developing and fostering strong relationships with individuals, with communities, and developing networks as well. So most recently, and I believe what she's going to be talking about today, she directs the NSERC ResNet. This is a pan-Canadian network designed to support Canada's capacity to monitor, model, and manage its working landscapes and seascapes, and all of the ecosystem services they provide. This is for the long-term shared health, prosperity, and resilience for all Canadians through community-engaged research. Her research focuses on understanding and managing for multifunctional working landscapes, doing this through a better understanding of the relationships between people, ecosystems, and the provision of ecosystem services. So Elena received her master's in land resources as well as a PhD here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's very thrilled to be coming home for this conference and to be able to give us the plenary today. So please join me in welcoming Elena Bennett.
I'm going to put this down there where I can't spill it. Thanks, Carrie. That was such a generous welcome here, and I am really thrilled to be back on what I see as my old stomping grounds, and I'm really thrilled with John's really interesting talk about lessons from the past, and I'm going to now take that and sort of turn our view and vision and thinking to the future. I'll take all that optimism and talk a little bit about how we can build a better Anthropocene. So as I was preparing this talk, thinking about what I wanted to say, what kind of message I wanted to deliver, I found myself thinking about this theme of adapting to a changing world, and made me wonder about, is there something that we can do that isn't only reactively adapting to a world that is changing around us, but are there ways that we can actively envision the future that we want to bring about? And if we can do that, how do we do that? And then if we have that vision, what kind of science do we then need to make that vision a reality? So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of time on how we can go about envisioning a better future and what that might look like, true to my optimistic nature, I guess. And then from there, talk about what kind of science we might need to then build that future that we have collectively envisioned. So I'll start in the Anthropocene. It's a new geologic epoch in which humankind has emerged as a globally significant and potentially intelligent force, capable of really reshaping, completely changing the planet. And so what you're looking at here, starting on the bottom about 2.5 billion years ago, is all the epochs reaching our way up to the current official epoch, the Holocene. And I'll just throw on top there the Anthropocene, not an official epoch that gets decided by the International Union of Geological Sciences, but it's a useful term and a common term that we use to sort of acknowledge to ourselves the massive role that people play in shaping the different processes that are happening on our planet. So what does it mean to us then to live in the Anthropocene, where we are dominating a lot of the ecological processes that we see around us, and that were very clearly, I think, laid out in John's talk about seabirds? So if we think about that by taking a step back into the Holocene, I'll just use a little bit of thinking about how different this is. So this graph shows you living conditions on Earth over the last 100,000 years through a proxy for temperature. That's about half the span of which there were modern humans on the planet. And so what you see in the blue line there is global average temperature really bouncing around a lot. And as it bounces around, it causes crises for people, and those crises cause people to migrate from one part of the planet to another part of the planet. And then about 10,000 years ago, we enter the Holocene, and things get incredibly stable relative to that previous 100,000 years. And about 1,000 years into that stability, we get agriculture. And from agriculture, we get basically everything else that we study when we study human history. You get all the great modern civilizations in China, the Greek civilizations, Romans, everything else happens during that period of stability. And as we're well aware at this point, we are starting to move out of that period of stability for reasons of climate change, of biodiversity loss, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of what happens in people's brains, I think, when I start talking about this, is everyone pops these images up into your head, and you think about dystopia and how bad things are and how much worse they're going to get. And there's it is not unreasonable for us to have these sorts of images in our minds when we think about what the future in the Anthropocene might bring. To me, I think they're also very dangerous to have only this kind of image in our mind when we think about the future. So if you have driven your car past an accident, rode your bike past something bad happening on the side of the road, you will know that when you do that and that thing catches your eye, you turn to look at it and you turn your steering wheel. So I would contend that if these are the images that we have in our head when we think about the Anthropocene, these are the sorts of futures that we're going to drive ourselves towards, even if we're not trying to, even if we know that that's not where we want to be. So I spend a bunch of time thinking about how we can come up with a better vision. Can we even come up with maybe a fabulous vision, as in this is a piece of artwork by Robin Woolston. It's not actually an era, it's an epic, but we'll overlook that. She's an artist. And these, so how do you envision this, and then how do you get there? And when I think about that, and I'll just sort of lay this is my personal belief system cards, and I'm going to lay them on the table. I think a lot of us hold in our minds, in our hearts, a thought that goes something like, people are generally bad for the environment. The key to a better future is to somehow restrict ourselves, keep ourselves out of the best places, make sure that we don't get in there and mess it up. It's not necessarily untrue, but I'm not sure that it is useful. And I wonder whether we can come up with a different narrative that has a different role for people on the planet, a role where we are maybe stewards, maybe even a force for good, sort of making and creating a better future. And I like to think about that from the framework of stories. Why stories? Stories are really powerful. They help us explain the reality that we find ourselves in. They also sort of create it in front of our very eyes by giving us a framework in which to fit things. So scientists have a particular way of telling stories about the future that's called scenario building, and scenarios are stories that we tell, usually in groups of 3 or 4, about the future. They have a logical plot and a storyline along which they unfold. And that's the scientists' way of talking about the future. They were actually first developed by the military. Scenarios were then picked up by big business, most famously by Shell Oil, and then finally started to be used in global assessments like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. A lot of the global scientific community's efforts to build scenarios, a lot of them have been negative, but the ones that have been positive, I think, have sort of vastly overestimated pretty standard kinds of techniques and strategies. They've overestimated the impact that those are going to have on creating real change. So, for example, these are images of 2 of the scenarios that we told or built for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment about 20 years ago. And we wanted to show here the difference between a world in which people work together to make a better future and a world in which people built walls, rich people built walls to keep poor people out. It's probably no big surprise, the world in which people work together worked a lot better than the world in which the big walls go up. And, that's fine, but I'm not sure that it's hugely insightful about how to bring about a better future. And a lot of the scenarios around this time tended to fall back on some of the same kind of tropes about how to make a better future. We should work together. We should have better technology. We should slow the pace of population growth. We should change the way we do environmental education. So kind of standard stories. And it's not that those aren't important, but we've been trying them for a long time, and it hasn't really gotten us to where we want to go. So sort of following the same set of ideas, they don't have, I think, the richness, the detail, the inventiveness that we need to really envision, okay, what is really a radically different, really interesting, better future that we can get to. Why is that? Let me just take a step back for just a second and say, so why do we keep coming up with these kind of, blah, blah, blah stories about the future? I like to think of this in my mind. It's like standing in the Middle Ages and saying, yeah, the future is going to look something like this, right? I mean, it's really, it's actually really hard to do that kind of radical, inventive, creative thinking about the future, especially if you're thinking, 100, 200, 500 years out into the future. So very appealing to tell better stories about the future, very hard to tell better stories about the future. So along with some colleagues, most notably Gary Peterson and Unsi Biggs, we have been working on coming up with a way to tell better, richer stories about what a good future might look like. So this project is called Seeds of Good Anthropocenes Project, and it's based on this idea that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that as people are faced with difficulties, they start doing stuff to make their little local part of the planet better. They might go into an abandoned lot and start gardening it. They might try to change the way their community approaches education in some way. So we call these things seeds of good Anthropocenes. They're ideas, ways of being, projects that aren't widespread, they're not well known, they might be just emerging. They can be social initiatives, they can be economic tools, social ecological projects. We have a very, very wide view and vision of what these can be. And we've been basically collecting examples of these from around the world and studying them and trying to learn about what makes them tick, learn about what makes them work, and then also use them to tell stories and as a sort of seed of what a radically different future might be like. So I'll give you an example and then I'll tell you a little bit more about them just so you can get a picture in your mind. This is one of my favorite examples. It's called Health in Harmony. It was started by a doctor from the Pacific Northwest called Kinari Webb. And she was visiting Indonesian Borneo, got really distraught about orangutans and loss of biodiversity, and just started talking to people. And invented what she called radical listening, which was a way of going to these communities and asking them, what is going on here? What is the problem? What do you need? And what she found from doing that in these particular communities was this was not big business coming in and cutting down this part of the Borneo rainforest. This was actually local people who their mom got sick, their child got sick, and they couldn't afford health care. And the way they could afford it was to go cut down some trees and sell the trees or the timber, and that's how they could have money for healthcare. She spent a bunch of time thinking about this and came up with a plan, which was basically to formulate contracts, and when whole communities could get together and sign these contracts and commit to not cutting down trees, she would come in with her doctor friends and provide them free or low-cost health care, build clinics, and help in that community. And they've had really amazing success, saving thousands of hectares of rainforest. Basically, every measure of human health that they assess in this region has improved really dramatically in the 10 or 15 years that they've been working here. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we're looking at when we talk about seeds of good Anthropocenes. We now have a team of a couple dozen people collecting these. This slide is a little bit old. We have about 1,000 of them that we have collected from all over the world, and we have a database about where they are, who's working on them, what they're doing. And we've developed a method that we use to take those seeds and use them as the basis for developing new scenarios about the future. So how we do that, in the center of these, what we call future wheels, the white thing in the middle is a seed, and we work with communities and we say, okay, if that was fully mature, and that was sort of the way the world worked, what's the first round of follow-on effects that would have? And then what effects would that have? And then what effects would that have? And we basically invite people to imagine a world in which that's how the world works and what other things does that impact. And it turns out that if you do that for 2 or 3 seeds, and then you start to ask, how do all of these things interact? What you develop is a pretty robust story about a future. And those stories tend to be both a little bit more radical than the stories that we were developing or scenarios that we were developing in the Millennium Assessment. So they're a little bit more radical than those. They start from something that people are already doing. They're a better reflection of what people actually want from their future. And they also tend to reflect things that we never thought about in the Millennium Assessment as drivers of change. Like a really common recurring one is how people conceive of and use time, and how they conceive of and use work time especially, and where free time goes, and what people are able to do in that free time. That never would have occurred to me as a major driver of environmental movements, but it shows up again and again around the world as we do this. We then use what's called the 3 Horizons framework to think about how can we get from where we are now to those futures that people are envisioning. So we think about the first horizon, which is things that are very common in the world now but need to go away to get to that seed envisioned good future. We think about the third horizon, which is stuff that doesn't exist yet but needs to bubble up in order to get to that future. And then the sort of messy middle of the second horizon where there's a lot of uncertainty and things bouncing around. And we've done these workshops now all over the world. These are some images from an Inuit artist that we worked with in Cambridge Bay in the Canadian Arctic, where we did scenarios with the community. And I have these here because one of the things that I want to tell you about the futures that come up, and something that shows up again and again and again in these, is relationships. Again and again, no matter where I am, when I'm working with communities, talking about a better future, they are talking to me about relationships. Their relationships with their family, their relationships with the rest of the community, and their relationships with nature, and even nature's relationships with itself. This is just this very, very, I don't know, red thread that goes through all of these scenarios about people's relationships with one another and how central that is to the kind of world that they want to live in. So I don't hear so much about having more food to eat, or having fewer people in this park or more people in that park. I hear about people's relationships to each other and to the natural world. Okay, so just at halftime, that's just where I wanted to be. It's good. I wanted to spend that first half of my time with you kind of establishing the importance of visions of the future, the importance of positive visions of the future, maybe even a little bit of establishing in you a sort of longing for this wide open sea of a better future. And now I want to spend the last half of my time with you talking about the science. So what's the science that we need to be doing to build that better future that communities are envisioning around the world? Okay, so this is a figure from a new pair of papers that Belinda Reyers and I have been working on, both of which are coming out this year. They build on an earlier history of conservation that was developed by Georgina Mace in a 2014 paper that's become sort of a conservation touchstone that move and that focus on relationships. That's the thread here from the visions to where I'm going next, is this relationship focused. And these really move from nature and people as being separate through nature and people as being coupled and intertwined. So I'm going to walk through these one by one because they'll be essential for what I'm going to talk about next. So in Georgina Mace's paper, she starts in the 1960s with conservation, and what she calls it is nature for itself. This is a world in which conservation is thinking about wilderness, parks, excluding people. That's kind of the central theme of how people thought about nature in this sort of 1960s nature for itself. Now we move into the 1970s, the 1980s, and according to Georgina, we're now going to move into nature despite people. So now we're thinking about negative impacts of people on the planet. The environmental movement really starts in earnest during this time period. We then move to nature for people. This is back to that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment time that I was talking about before, a decade on. Now we're thinking about the benefits that nature delivers to people. And I should mention, all of these framings, when Mace is pointing out these changes, the framings shift when people become a little bit disillusioned and say, ooh, that framing isn't working so well. We need another one. The framing starts to shift to new ideas. How can we do this a little bit better? Now, in introducing these, so Georgina's paper comes out in 2014, and she says, okay, right now we're shifting into a new mode. And that new mode is called people and nature. And now we're going to be interdisciplinary in our science. We're going to have these methods that are going to underpin conservation science that have real integration of social and ecological interdependence, that are recognizing change as a constant. This is going to be the new thing, and now we're going to improve conservation with this. What Belinda and I are proposing in our new paper is actually that we're now a decade out from that last framing, and it's time for a new one. So we see now our current era, it's not only a time of issues like climate change, continuing decline in biodiversity, but for the first time ever, we're starting to see declines in human well-being. So in 2020, the Human Development Index dropped for the first time ever due to growing inequality, increasing polarization of societies, increases in human insecurity. And so now maybe what we need is a new phase of acceptance of people's relationships with nature, which we're calling people with nature, to really center not only a sort of loosely coupled two-way flow that was in Mace's people and nature, but now a new conservation that even does away with those distinctions and really focuses on the relationship, the link between people and nature, the social ecological relationship itself becomes the key framing. And that's really following from a lot of complex adaptive system science, more relational approaches that we see coming to the fore in sustainability science, deepening engagement of conservation with social sciences and even with humanities and with arts. A lot of recent moves to decolonize science, to mobilize global South leadership. All of those things, I think, are leading to this emergence of people with nature. And along with those shifts, we see changes in science. So from nature for itself through to people and nature, or even people with nature, a science that's gone from being monodisciplinary to interdisciplinary, to multidisciplinary, to interdisciplinary, and now to transdisciplinary, where we really see a lot of science that's actually being led by communities saying, hey, we have a question, scientists, come help us answer that question. It's come along with changes in values, from intrinsic value of nature to instrumental value, what is the stuff I can get, to now a relational value where we're focused on relationships. So with that history in place, I'm going to turn my attention to Canada for this last part of the talk. We've got a Canadian Day going on here. So Canada, incredibly diverse country, naturally very diverse country in its ecosystems, its landscapes, its biodiversity, and culturally very rich and very diverse. It's also very rich in natural resources. It has an economy that is strongly rooted in resource extraction, energy, timber, agri-food play very, very strongly in the Canadian economy. And you can imagine that managing working landscapes, by which I mean agricultural landscapes, fisheries landscapes, all the landscapes that are providing those resources, becomes really important. How do you manage those for sustainability? How do you manage those for a better future? Canada is also a country with a vision. This is a government document about how we're going to achieve a sustainable future in Canada by focusing on all these various things. That's important. It's good to have a vision for where you want to go. And even something of a plan. So just in the last few years, Canada has announced a multi-million-dollar project to build a roadmap to sustainability through a census of environment. So basically taking a census, doing an assessment of of the natural environment. And that census will be built around measuring ecosystem services, or sometimes called NCP, or Nature's Contributions to Canada, or Nature's Contributions to People, sorry, very Canadian focused today, all around Canada. And I'm very interested in how they're going to go about doing that. What exactly are they going to measure, and where and how? So ecosystem services, these benefits that people receive from nature, everything from in the soybean field just outside my hometown might include water quality regulation, pest control, recreation, food production, climate regulation through carbon storage. So a big variety of things that we might measure. So if we think for a minute about a typical Canadian forest landscape, so at one point in time, the way we might have gone about trying to measure the ecosystem services that were delivered by that landscape. So if we think about in the nature for people time, we might have said, the way to assess the value of this landscape is to figure out how many board feet of timber that forest represents. So that's firmly in nature for people territory, 45,627 board feet. Great, how many was it yesterday? How many is it going to be tomorrow? And away you go. In the last 10 to 20 years or so, there's been a really big push to recognize that there's not just timber being produced on that landscape. There's a lot of things being produced. People might be hiking there. They might be collecting salal or berries, or we are storing carbon there. Canada's very fond of measuring all the carbon that we're storing in our forests right about now. And so this thinking about multiple ecosystem services, it really still leaves us kind of firmly in that nature for people world. It's a step, it's an advance, it's an important advance, but what it doesn't get to is it doesn't get us a sense of how the services came to be there. How did they get produced? Is it just nature that's making them? What's the role of people in making sure that those services get produced? And the reason that's so important is that we're trying to figure out not how to manage the forest, but how to manage ourselves, how to manage our interaction with that forest, our relationship with that forest. And we can't do it if we don't know what's the role of nature and what's our role and what's the relationship between those two in the delivery of services. So to me, if we want to move into people and nature, or even better, people with nature, we need to have answers about these relationships that we have and the role that we're playing in delivery of services in order to improve our management. If we don't have that, I think that where we end up is a world where we're going to make really critically important decisions about the future of these working landscapes. And we're going to do it in an isolated way, in a piecemeal way, and with a really limited picture of the economic risks, the ecological risks, the social risks that are associated with the kinds of decisions that we're making about farms like this one, or about forests like the forest that I just showed. That leads me to needing a new kind of science, a kind of science that is integrating across services, across sectors, across places, that is bringing together all the natural science of understanding how that forest works with the social science of understanding how people interact with that forest, with even maybe arts and humanities that help us think about envisioning the kind of future that we want, and how the decisions that we're making today are going to play out in terms of those futures. This is something that we're trying to do in ResNet, the project that Carrie mentioned that I'm leading across Canada. We're now about 200 scholars strong, and we have 3 primary goals. We're really working in a transdisciplinary way. We are trying to answer stakeholder questions about land management, and seascape management in these places. We're trying to improve scientific information about ecosystem services, really advance into people with nature, and then use the results of those to inform this Canadian Census of Environment about how they might best go about measuring the state of Canada's environment. So our mission is to promote sustainable and resilient ecosystems throughout Canada. We are based mostly in 6 different working landscapes across Canada, and in each one of those we have community partners who've come to us with questions. We're trying to understand how ecosystem services are produced through interactions of social and ecological processes, and then use that to inform management for resilient futures of these landscapes. Each landscape has its own ecosystem service dilemmas, and so it has some of its own services that it's uniquely measuring, but we have a set of services that we're also measuring across all of the landscapes in order to try to get a little bit more sense of how things are similar and different across a really big country. If I introduce you to a couple of these just to give you a sense of what it is that we're doing. So Kate Sharon from Dalhousie is leading our easternmost landscape. This is a landscape in which the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture came to us and said, listen, we've got something like 80 kilometers of dikelands that we're maintaining. We can't afford to maintain them all anymore. We'd like to realign some, we'd like to remove others, we'd like to keep still others in place. How do we decide which ones get which kind of treatment? So this is really about balancing different ecosystem services, and different communities have different interests for different services, some of which are recreating along the top of dikes or hunting seabirds and things in the salt marshes, or having agriculture that is protected from sea level rise behind these dikelands. Kate and her team have built an incredible spaghetti diagram of how services are delivered here. The important thing to get from this really is this is all about on this left-hand side has the ecosystems, then we've got some anthropogenic actions in the center. So she's really digging into how does the relationship that people have with this ecosystem result in the delivery of ecosystem services, and then what are the indicators? What can we actually measure to try to understand and put some numbers on this spaghetti diagram? Ann Salomon at Simon Fraser University on the West Coast is working with 17 First Nations that are part of the Great Bear Initiative. And really what is happening here is thinking about management of sea otters and shellfish and fisheries for food security of these 17 First Nations, and for self-led, self-directed food security and food management of these regions. Again, it's a very intertwined people with nature view of how this system works and how we can manage this system to make sure that we have Indigenous sovereignty over managing otters and shellfish and food security in the system. And I'll just do one more in the Northwest Territory. Here, really, the question is about whether the North can feed itself. This is one of Canada's most food insecure regions, and the government is estimating that climate change is going to open about 9.1 million square kilometers of what is now carbon-rich peatland to possible agriculture. And so the question is, should we do that? And then if we should, how would you do that? What are the pathways to realize the potential of those frontiers while minimizing the potential negative impacts on carbon storage? In all of these cases, we're measuring things, we're working with communities, we're assessing ecosystem services, and we're also tracking for ourselves what are the key indicators? What are the things that you measure that aren't just the service, but that really get at that relationship between people and nature? And then how can we deliver that to Statistics Canada for their Canadian census of environment, to have a sense of measuring not just what's there right now or what's provided yesterday, but what the potential is for what the future can provide. Ultimately, all of this services measured, all the things that we're learning about our work, we're using to build into an ecosystem service observatory that we see as a sort of pilot for that census of environment. It's an online platform, will be, I should say, an online platform. We're just doing the wrap up of this. Will be an online platform where everyone can access ecosystem service data and information about relationships between people and nature that we have learned from working over the past 5 years across these 6 landscapes. I'm actually going to skip that one and I'll just skip right through to just wrapping things up by saying, you know, I think we all want a better future. We all hope that it's not going to be that dystopian image that I started with, but, you know, maybe something a little greener. I was going to say wetter, but maybe not after the weather that we've had this week, but a little greener. And to me, I think with a combination of bringing in some of the art of storytelling, visioning what a better future looks like, and then some science to really get in there and measure and better understand what do these relationships between people and nature look like, and what do we need them to look like so that we can envision a better future and build the kind of science that we need to get there. Thank you. Maybe one question? Okay. So there's time for one quick question, I've been told.
I just want to say thank you so much for a lovely presentation. And wow. It's on? Okay. Thank you. That was just a lovely presentation. And I want to I could say many things, including just the link with yesterday's presentation, that if we had engaged in that 50 years ago, we would be in a very, very different place with respect to understanding how to implement our science. But all of us, I'd like your perspective, all of us probably are teaching undergraduates, or most of us are, and it's a very frightening thing for our undergraduates, the way we teach. I speak to my undergraduates about it's very easy to imagine an apocalypse, and but we keep tumbling into the future, and maybe we should start imagining a future. I would like your perspective on how to change our teaching, because we're teaching this nature versus humans. We're back in the 60s in terms of how we teach ecological theory, and it's frightening our students. And it's not turning them into ecologists, it's turning them into scared human beings. And most of our students are not going to become ecologists anyways. So I'd actually love just some input on pedagogy.
Excellent. Okay, so confession time. Part of the impetus for the Seeds of Good Anthropocene project came, I teach in Earth systems, like a sort of systems ecology of the Earth class. And I went through a whole semester. I thought it was a great semester. And I got to the end, and a student came up to thank me for the class. And the thing that he said was, this was a great class, but how do you go on day after day? And I realized that I had just spent months basically telling everybody, you know, how terrible the world was and how bad people were. And, you know, this is how our systems should work, and this is how we've messed them all up. And it really changed the way I have approached that class. It's taken took starting the Seeds of Good Anthropocene project, and then a few years to really reorganize around not here's an Earth system and here's how we've messed it up, and then here's the next Earth system and here's how we've messed it up, to here's how people interact with these Earth systems. And some of those things are indeed really problematic, and some of those things aren't. And how can we lean towards the ones that aren't and lean away from the ones that are? But I would welcome, I don't feel like I'm the person who has the answer to that question, so I would welcome over the next day or two having more conversation with anyone who wants to about how we can build our classes to not scare the crap out of all of our students. Thanks for that question.
All right, wonderful. Well, a reminder that lunch is on your own again today. Please visit the rooftop terrace, the Locals Guide to Madison. The farmers market is set up just a floor up just outside, and I saw Stella's bread out there, for those who know. Some highlights today, the Drawing Water art exhibit. You can see down in the community terrace room, this is professional artists and professional scientists at Trout Lake Station who came together and produced these works, learned from each other. Poster hall and exhibit hall are open all day. There's also an early career lunch workshop happening just after this in Hall of Ideas F. The Women and Non-Binary People of Color in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology networking event is happening this evening. You're encouraged to attend. And
finally, the ASLO 2024 party on the rooftop terrace, 7 p.m. tonight. See you there.
all right, wonderful. Have a great
Thank you,
rest of your
everyone. Awesome plenary. Wow.
Yeah.
Like they connect too.